Okay, this is Revolutionary War Part 5. Hoping to finish the comparison of the two sides this time. I'll have to speed things up. All right, we've dealt with three of the British strategies so far. Only one of them took much time, but if they could destroy the Continental Army, they probably win for the time being. Capturing key cities, they do that with little resistance, but it doesn't win the war for them. Their strategy where they thought they could wall New England off and eliminate New England from the war and then deal with the rest of it elsewhere. This was came to be called the Saratoga campaign because it just, the wheels came off. The play didn't run as diagrammed. We described that in some detail in part 4. And not only did it not win the war for them, you could make a case that it lost the war for them because it led to a military defeat, the surrender of a major British army with several thousand soldiers who were not released. They were held as prisoners of war for the rest of the war, and Britain couldn't afford to try to keep fighting without them because France had joined the war as an ally of the United States, and in 1778, 1779, Spain joined the war as an ally of France, but not of the United States. In 1780, the Brits themselves declared war on the Netherlands, so it widened into a war where long story short, they couldn't do it all, so had to cut their losses and had to cut us loose. But we'll get to that. Okay, the other two, the fourth one on my list has to do with the South, the Southern strategy. They moved the war to the South on the information that there were a lot of loyalists in the South, and there was a pocket of loyalists in coastal North Carolina, places like that. But that wasn't so much that they were loyal to Britain, it's that in North Carolina you'd had a civil war going on since 1770 without reference to Britain. And the two sides called themselves the regulators and the moderators, and I don't know which one went which way or what they were actually fighting about, but one of them went with the cause of independence, so the other automatically went the other direction. So there you are. Now, the British idea, since the war was stalemated in the North, was that they would capture the southern coastal cities, encourage all these loyalists, and these are Americans who are opposed to independence, encourage them to go on the offensive, give them just enough military support that they can take control of their states, specifically South Carolina, maybe Georgia, North Carolina, and then they would simply knock over the states, reconquer them one at a time, heading back north. Now, loyalist support was always disappointing. The whole British war plan depended largely on loyalists rising and joining in support. And some did. Around 50,000 Americans bore arms on the British side at one time or another during the war. But most of the time, the loyalists would be more well-to-do people. They would meet surreptitiously with the British and say, "We're with you, we're on your side." But as far as doing anything or picking up a musket, not so much, except really in the South. So they captured Wilmington, they captured Savannah, they captured Charlestown, as it was called at the time, South Carolina, after a lengthy siege when roughly a 5,000-man American army eventually surrendered, that being our greatest defeat of the war. General Howe had been recalled to London to answer some tough questions. His place as commander in America was taken by General Henry Clinton. It may have been Sir Henry Clinton. That might have been later. I don't even know for sure. He's almost a homeboy. I think his father had been royal governor of New York. What Clinton did was park the main British army in New York City and send maybe about a fourth of it down to the Carolinas. And came down himself, then went back, leaving the Army to carry out the Southern strategy under the command of General Charles Cornwallis. Very aristocratic man, uh, related to the royal family. Cornwallis was a qualified, experienced general, but this is not his kind of war. I mentioned this earlier. Cornwallis allowed himself to be lured into the interior of South Carolina, where the culture was very different and the kind of enemy you're going to encounter very different from what you would encounter anywhere else. They won a battle early on at Camden, where Horatio Gates again was out there trying to, he should have known better, trying to fight the British in a European style. Gates, as I said earlier, had been an officer in the British Army before resigning and coming to America. And not only did he suffer a crushing defeat, he himself proved himself to be a coward. He jumped on a horse and didn't get off for 60 miles. That eliminated him from serious consideration for anything. Well, um, but then he's chasing American troops led by a Rhode Islander named Nathaniel Greene. Nathaniel spelled a little different from usual. I'll put it on the board, E on the end. And more battles in the Revolutionary War were fought in South Carolina within less than a year than in any other state. So Greene always was very careful to get the best maps. He knew where the rivers could be forded, where the bridges were. He knew all of that. And he always stayed just ahead of Cornwallis. And Cornwallis's army is going to continually get weaker. Greene's is going to continually get stronger. Okay? So what this did was completely alienate most of the pro-British support in the colonies. Just having the British, thinking about the British somewhere else, that's one thing. Having them march through your own countryside is another. Because they were marauders, they'd live off the land, they would clean you out, and, take your cattle and your crops and cut down your orchards, all of that. The troops filling out the ranks in the British Army were often just from the dregs of British society. And military discipline could hardly keep them under control. I mean, there were instances where if they don't want anyone reporting their movements, they would kill anyone who just happened to casually see them march by, so they won't, blab. That included sometimes small boys who can't resist going to watch the soldiers go by. There was a particularly disturbing case of two elderly widows living together. They were staunch Tories. They were supporters of the king, as they had always been. That did not prevent British soldiers from raping and murdering them. So the North Carolinians forgot their differences between the moderators and the regulators, and what had been largely apathy. A good bit of what the British had mistaken for loyalism was mainly apathy. Just wake me when it's over. On second thought, don't. They became raging partisans in favor of independence and against the British. So this strategy fell through. There were two battles early in 1781 that would tell the tale there. One of them was the Battle of King's Mountain, where there was only one British soldier there. That was a general who was in command of an army of loyalists. And he had posted handbills all over the area commanding the Southerners to report to certain checkpoints and turn in their firearms. You try that. Tell Southerners to show up and turn in their firearms. Why don't we just do that? Okay. The Battle of Kings Mountain was a solid victory for independence. The American commander there was a man named Daniel Morgan, and he commanded two regiments of, listen to what I'm saying here, riflemen. Rifles were available. Why didn't they use them in military, for military uses? The lesser reason was that they just hadn't been manufactured where you could stick a bayonet on one of them. The other, it took a lot longer to reload one. Whereas a musket could be ready to fire again in the hands of a skilled musketeer in like 20 seconds. A rifle could take up in the minutes to do that because the bullet has to fit precisely in your with your ramrod trying to get it loaded. But these Southerners could pick off a target, 300 yards away. They're good with those things. The other battle in early 1781 was called the Battle of Cowpens. This time, I believe Nathaniel Greene was in charge of the Americans and used militia effectively. Now, militia can't be dependent on to hang around in a fight. They're not trained like regulars are. So he deployed lines of militiamen in front of his regulars, and they were out there so he could fire one volley, maybe two, then get out. That degrades the British forces. Bottom line, not to go into detail on the battle, this was a solid American victory, and it indicated that the British were pretty much finished. That's what kind of war this was. This was nasty. This degenerated into a brutal just war of neighbor against neighbor, uh, settling old grudges, that sort of thing. This was nasty. All right, so the Southern strategy is a solid blow up in your face failure. The fifth British strategy that also didn't work was that they would assume that they would control the ocean with their mighty fleet. Generally they did, but that failed them. That failed them at a critical moment, leading directly to the end of the war. By 1781, both sides are virtually exhausted. In America, war weariness is set in very deep. General Washington has been sitting up there outside New York City without fighting a major engagement for 3 years. But the end came in the South. General Cornwallis received orders to move his army from Wilmington, North Carolina, up to Virginia, take up a position on the Virginia coast, wait for a British fleet that's going to come down and evacuate his men back to New York City. But that was one of his options. He had two or three others. Remember that George Germain is giving him so many options? So anyway, he marches up to Virginia, plays tag all summer, and in 1781 against American forces commanded by the extremely young and brilliant Frenchman, the Marquis de Lafayette, who came to personally symbolize French assistance. And at the end of the summer, Cornwallis took up a position at a port town called Yorktown on the York River in Virginia, and there to await the fleet. Well, the fleet didn't come. This delay followed delay, and George Washington came. They got word to him, if you can get down here quick enough, we might bag Cornwallis, and we'll take that. So Washington brought his men partly by sea, partly by land, including several thousand French regulars. We got the French army over here. The French had huge siege guns where they could knock down fortifications. They had military engineers who knew how to lay a siege. They knew how to dig zigzag trenches where you get right up to the walls of a fortification without ever being exposed to be shot at. So September and about half of October, you have the siege of Yorktown. And by late September, the British fleet finally arrived, only to find a more powerful French fleet waiting for them. And so there's a naval engagement, variously called the Battle of the Capes or the Battle off the Virginia Capes, something like that. The two fleets sailed off over the horizon, shooting at each other. No ships were actually sunk. Both fleets were heavily damaged. The British fleet had to limp back to New York City for repairs, leaving Cornwallis hung out to dry. He's going to have to survive a winter on the Virginia coast in a position he himself doubted was defensible. He just didn't know he was going to have to defend it. Middle of October, two key salients or strong points in the middle of the British line were captured by night attacks, one involving French soldiers, the other one Americans, commanded by none other than Alexander Hamilton, who was tired of being a secretary, and Washington finally let him have some action. That left the British lines indefensible, leading directly to Cornwallis's surrender, and we're going to pick up with that in the next part. You can kind of guess that this thing toward the end was kind of scraps patched together. So we'll move on to the circumstances of Cornwallis's defeat next time.